For 34 years, a single coffee cup sat unnoticed in an evidence box, its secrets waiting to be uncovered. In a small Montana town, a trusted community figure hid a dark truth behind decades of friendly smiles and daily routines. When science finally caught up to the past, that forgotten piece of evidence cracked open a mystery that had haunted investigators and shattered a family for generations. This is the story of how one clue exposed a predator hiding in plain sight. For more than 3 decades, the mystery of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance sat in the cold case files like a silent wound that never healed. Evidence had been collected, leads had been chased, and suspects had been questioned, but nothing ever brought the truth to light. Among the many items stored in the evidence boxes was a simple, forgotten object, a discarded coffee cup found near the place Sarah was last seen. At the time, in 1987, DNA analysis was still in its early stages. Investigators couldn't do much with such a small sample, so the cup was sealed, labeled, and placed into storage, where it waited for someone to take a second look. Years later, that person was Detective Rebecca Chen. She had joined the department long after Sarah went missing, but the case haunted her. She wasn't just a detective. She was someone who believed that every piece of evidence had a story to tell, no matter how much time had passed. When she came across the old coffee cup during a routine cold case review, she felt something stir inside her. This was a lead that had been overlooked for too long. The cup was carefully packaged and sent to the Montana State Crime Lab, accompanied by Chen's personal request for expedited processing. She knew that the chances were slim. After more than 30 years, DNA could degrade and environmental factors might have destroyed anything useful. But she also knew that modern forensic science had advanced far beyond what investigators in the 1980s could have imagined. Even the tiniest trace of saliva on that cup could hold answers that had been hidden for decades. The waiting period was agonizing. 6 long weeks passed as forensic scientists worked with delicate precision, trying to extract and amplify any remaining DNA. Chen checked her inbox every morning with quiet hope, knowing that this evidence might be the key to unlocking everything. When the lab results finally arrived, they changed the course of the investigation. The scientists had managed to recover 2 DNA profiles from the rim of the coffee cup. One profile matched Sarah Mitchell, confirmed through samples collected from her hairbrush many years earlier. The second profile belonged to an unknown male, someone whose genetic markers told a story, but whose name was still hidden. The unknown DNA was immediately uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains millions of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, unsolved crime scenes, and missing persons cases across the United States. If this man had ever been arrested for a serious crime, or if his DNA had been collected in another investigation, CODIS would have returned a match. But the search came back empty. There was no match in the entire national database. For many detectives, this would have been the moment where hope slipped away again. It suggested that the suspect had either never been arrested for a felony requiring DNA collection, or that the crime took place before DNA collection became mandatory. In other words, the man who took Sarah had likely lived his life without ever stepping into the justice system. For Detective Chen, however, this was not a dead end. It was a turning point. She understood that the traditional investigative methods had taken the Sarah Mitchell case as far as they could go. It was time to look beyond conventional tools and embrace the new era of forensic science. That's when she turned to a groundbreaking technique: forensic genetic genealogy. Unlike CODIS, this method didn't rely on criminals being in a database. Instead, it compared the unknown DNA to public genealogy databases, where ordinary people voluntarily submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry and family history. By finding distant relatives of the unknown suspect, genealogists could build family trees and work backward to identify the person who left their DNA on that cup. This was a revolutionary approach, one that had cracked many cold cases across the country in recent years. But it was also delicate, requiring every molecule of genetic material the lab could recover. Chen knew the sample from the coffee cup was old and fragile, so she partnered with a private laboratory in Virginia that specialized in handling degraded evidence. As she prepared the files and sent the unknown male's DNA profile for advanced analysis, Chen couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of determination. For years, Sarah's case had felt like a door that could never be opened. Now, for the first time in decades, that door had begun to creak open. The DNA on that coffee cup, left behind without a second thought in 1987, was no longer silent. It had found its voice through science, and that voice was about to lead investigators down a path that would finally expose the truth. The unknown male DNA from the coffee cup had given Detective Chen a vital clue, but it was still just a genetic fingerprint without a name. There was no match in CODIS, no criminal record, and no direct lead pointing to the suspect's identity. But Chen wasn't ready to give up. She decided to use the power of family connections to find the man behind the DNA. Forensic genetic genealogy had changed how cold cases were solved. Instead of relying only on police databases, investigators could now compare crime scene DNA to public genealogy sites, places where millions of people had submitted their DNA to learn about their ancestry. Many of these individuals had no idea that their decision could one day help solve a decades-old crime. Even if the suspect himself had never submitted his DNA, a distant relative might have. And that was all Chen needed, one distant genetic match to start building a family tree that could lead her straight to the suspect. She sent the DNA profile to a private laboratory in Virginia, one known for handling fragile, decades-old evidence. Their experts worked carefully, using advanced methods to clean, amplify, and analyze every possible genetic marker. The process was slow and required immense patience. Once the lab completed its work, they uploaded the profile to genealogy databases with millions of user-submitted DNA samples. Then came the waiting. For 4 long months, powerful computers searched through genetic markers, comparing tiny DNA segments between the unknown male and millions of profiles. It was like looking for matching puzzle pieces in a box containing billions. Meanwhile, Chen kept working on other aspects of the case, but the thought of those results never left her mind. She knew that somewhere, hidden among countless family lines, was the clue that could change everything. Then, one cold morning in January 2020, Chen opened her email and saw a message from the laboratory. The subject line made her heart pound: "Genealogy results available." She clicked it immediately. The analysis had found a significant match, not to the suspect himself, but to a woman named Margaret Hendricks. Margaret had submitted her DNA 3 years earlier to learn more about her Irish immigrant ancestors. She had no connection to the case, no criminal record, and no idea that her family tree held the key to identifying a dangerous man. The match indicated that the unknown male was closely related to Margaret, most likely a brother, uncle, or male cousin. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough forensic genealogists hoped for. It meant investigators could now start mapping Margaret's family tree, searching through her relatives to find someone who fit the age, location, and timeline of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a forensic genealogist working with Chen, described the task as building a massive puzzle with many missing pieces. Using Margaret's profile as the starting point, they began constructing a mirror tree. This meant piecing together birth records, marriage certificates, census data, newspaper archives, and public documents across multiple generations. They looked at who Margaret's parents were, who their siblings were, and then followed each branch outward and downward, tracking cousins, uncles, nephews, and distant male relatives who could potentially be the unknown man. The work was intense and required collaboration with genealogy researchers from different states, especially Montana, where Sarah had lived. Bit by bit, names started appearing on the growing family tree: farmers, railroad workers, teachers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens whose lives had unknowingly intersected with this decades-old investigation. Within weeks, the investigation team identified 5 male relatives who could possibly match the unknown DNA based on their genetic relationship to Margaret. They narrowed the list further using key factors. Age: the suspect would have been an adult in 1987, likely between 25 and 40 years old. Location: he had to have been in or near Bozeman, Montana during the time of Sarah's disappearance. Life circumstances: investigators looked at jobs, addresses, criminal histories, and personal backgrounds. One by one, Chen carefully examined each man on the list. Some were eliminated quickly because they lived in other states during 1987. Others had medical records showing they were physically incapable of committing the crime. One had passed away years before Sarah's disappearance. Each elimination brought Chen closer to the truth. Finally, one name stood out: William Thomas Hendricks. Born in 1952, he would have been 35 at the time of Sarah's disappearance. He had lived in Bozeman since 1975. His work history showed positions that gave him access to schools and young people. His profile fit disturbingly well. For Chen, this was a chilling moment. For the first time, the unknown DNA had led to a real person with a face, a name, and a history, but she also understood this was just the beginning. Genetic genealogy could point investigators in the right direction. but it could not serve as the only proof in court. She would need solid evidence, surveillance, discarded DNA samples, records, and witness testimony to build an unshakable case. As she stared at the growing Hendricks family tree on her office wall, Chen realized that the answer had always been hidden in plain sight. All it took was one relative's decision to explore her ancestry to unlock decades of silence. The path to justice had begun, not through luck but through persistence, science, and the unbreakable connections written in our DNA. When Detective Chen placed William Thomas Hendricks's name on the board, a chill ran through her. For years, Hendricks had lived as a quiet, respected man in Bozeman, Montana. On the surface, he was the kind of person no one would suspect. He was polite, helpful, and always present at community events. To many, he was just Bill, a friendly neighbor with a warm smile. But beneath that calm exterior lay a darkness that had remained hidden for over 3 decades. Hendricks had moved to Bozeman in the mid-1970s. He found steady work at a local school, doing maintenance and odd jobs. His position gave him access to school grounds, classrooms, and sometimes even students, though no one had ever raised any serious complaints. Over the years, he became a familiar face to families in the area. People trusted him. Parents greeted him. Students saw him around but never paid much attention. He blended in so well that he was almost invisible. As Chen dug deeper into Hendricks's past, she began to see a pattern. He had lived alone for most of his life, never married, and had very few close friends. Former co-workers described him as quiet and kept to himself. A few remembered unsettling moments, times when he stared a little too long at young students, or appeared in places he wasn't expected to be, but back then, people brushed off such incidents. In the 1980s, small towns often trusted familiar faces without question. Hendricks used that trust as a shield. Chen obtained old employment records, school logs, and city archives to map Hendricks's movements during the time of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance in 1987. What she found was disturbing. Hendricks had been working less than 2 miles from Sarah's home at the time. He frequently passed through the same neighborhood. Several witnesses from the past had mentioned seeing a middle-aged man in a work uniform near the Mitchell home days before Sarah vanished, but no one had identified him back then. Now, decades later, that vague description lined up perfectly with Hendricks. Next, Chen and her team turned to public records, photographs, and yearbooks. They wanted to build a timeline of Hendricks's life, not just where he worked, but where he lived, where he spent his free time, and whether anyone had ever suspected him. His home was just a short drive from the location where Sarah's remains had been found years earlier. He had lived there continuously since the late 1970s, only changing jobs but never leaving the town. The most unsettling part was how ordinary his life appeared. There were no arrests, no major scandals, no reports that stood out. Hendricks had carefully avoided trouble. It was as if he understood how to live in the shadows, doing just enough to appear harmless but never too much to draw attention. As Chen read through old newspaper clippings, she discovered that Hendricks had even volunteered at community fairs and participated in neighborhood projects. There were photos of him smiling in groups, standing next to local families, including, shockingly, one image that featured the Mitchell family at a school event just months before Sarah disappeared. Hendricks was standing just a few feet away in the background, blending in like everyone else. This discovery shook Chen. For the Mitchell family, Hendricks wasn't some nameless stranger lurking in the dark. He had been right there among them, living his life while their tragedy remained unsolved. To understand his personality better, Chen spoke with people who had known Hendricks through the years. One retired teacher said, "Bill was always around, fixing something. You'd never think twice about him. But now that you're asking, yeah, there were moments. He'd show up after hours sometimes. It was odd, but no one ever said anything." Another neighbor recalled how Hendricks often took long, late-night walks. "I'd see him around midnight sometimes, walking down quiet streets. He said he liked the peace and quiet, but it always made me uneasy," the neighbor admitted. All of these little memories, once meaningless, now formed a clearer picture. Hendricks had hidden in plain sight. He wasn't a drifter or an outsider. He was part of the community. He attended events, waved at neighbors, and carried on like an ordinary man, while the truth of what he had done remained buried with the past. For Chen, this realization made the case even more personal. She understood that justice wasn't just about solving a crime, it was about exposing the betrayal of trust that had allowed a predator to walk freely for so long. Hendricks's mask of normalcy had protected him for decades, But now DNA had stripped that mask away, revealing the man behind it. The more Chen learned about Hendricks, the more determined she became. This was no random suspect. This was a man who had lived side by side with his victim's family, knowing the pain they carried, and never once showing a hint of guilt. The hunt for evidence to prove his guilt was no longer just an investigation. It was a mission to uncover the full truth that had been hidden for 34 years. Once William Thomas Hendricks's name rose to the top of the list, Detective Chen knew she had to be extremely careful. One wrong move could alert him and make gathering evidence harder. She also knew that genetic genealogy alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. She needed a direct DNA match between Hendricks and the unknown male DNA found on the coffee cup all those years ago. The challenge was simple but critical: how to get his DNA legally without tipping him off. Chen and her team decided to place Hendricks under covert surveillance. For weeks, plainclothes officers quietly followed his daily routine. They learned his habits, the places he liked to visit, and the time he left for work. Hendricks, now in his late 60s, led a simple and predictable life. He lived alone, rarely entertained visitors, and had a pattern that rarely changed. Every morning he stopped by the same small diner for breakfast. In the afternoons he often visited a local park to sit on a bench, reading old newspapers. At night he walked alone through his neighborhood before returning home. The team's goal was to find a discarded item, something that Hendricks had used and thrown away in public. This could be a coffee cup, water bottle, cigarette butt, napkin, or anything with his saliva or skin cells on it. Collecting such items from public places is a legal and common method for obtaining DNA evidence without a warrant, but it required patience, timing, and a lot of quiet observation. One cold March morning, Chen's team struck gold. After finishing his breakfast at the diner, Hendricks stood up, folded his newspaper, and walked out, leaving behind a used paper cup and a straw on the table. The moment he was out of sight, two surveillance officers entered, pretending to be ordinary customers. One casually picked up the cup using gloves and placed it in an evidence bag. The other paid for coffee to avoid suspicion. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing unusual had happened. The cup was immediately delivered to the Montana State Crime Lab, where technicians handled it with extreme care. They swabbed the straw and rim, extracting any saliva and skin cells left behind. Then they compared this fresh DNA sample to the unknown male DNA profile from Sarah Mitchell's case. The waiting period was tense. For Chen, this was the turning point. If the DNA didn't match, they would be back to square one. If it did match, it would mean that after more than 3 decades they had finally identified the man who had left his genetic trace at the scene of the crime. A week later, Chen received a call from the lab director. His voice was calm but carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. "Detective," he said, "we have a match. It's a full DNA profile match to the unknown male from the 1987 case. William Thomas Hendricks is your man." Chen closed her eyes for a moment, letting the news sink in. This was the confirmation she had been working toward, a clear, undeniable link between Hendricks and the evidence found decades ago. Science had spoken with certainty. With the DNA match in hand, Chen and the district attorney began preparing the legal steps needed to bring Hendricks to justice. They worked to obtain a search warrant for his home and personal belongings, ensuring that every piece of the investigation would hold up in court. They also reviewed surveillance footage, interviews, and historical records to build the strongest possible case. Meanwhile, the surveillance continued, not just to track his movements, but to make sure he didn't suddenly disappear. Hendricks went about his life as usual, completely unaware that law enforcement was closing in around him. The quiet man who had lived unnoticed for so long was now under the watchful eyes of detectives, every step recorded, every routine noted. Chen often reflected on the power of this moment. In 1987, DNA technology was still in its early stages. The idea that a tiny trace of saliva on a coffee cup could one day solve a brutal crime would have seemed impossible back then. But time and science had caught up. What Hendricks thought was forgotten had never truly gone away. The confirmation didn't bring closure yet, but it brought clarity. For years, the Mitchell family had lived with questions, doubts, and fear. Now there was a name, there was proof, and soon there would be accountability. The net was tightening around Hendricks. The man who had blended into the background for decades was about to face the consequences of his actions. And for Detective Chen, this was the beginning of the final chapter of a long and relentless pursuit of justice. Once the DNA match confirmed that William Thomas Hendricks was the man they had been searching for, Detective Chen knew the next step would be crucial. They had the science, they had the surveillance, and they had decades of unanswered questions. But now came the moment that would bring the hidden truth into the open, a direct confrontation. Early one morning, Hendricks was quietly picked up outside his home by two officers. He didn't resist. He appeared calm, almost indifferent, as if he couldn't quite understand why he was being taken in. At the station, he was escorted into a small interview room. The walls were plain, the lights soft but unflinching. He sat down slowly, his hands folded, his face unreadable. Detective Chen entered the room with a calm but firm presence. She had spent months studying Hendricks, his habits, his history, his silence. Now she needed to break through that wall. She began the interview gently, asking simple questions about his life, his work, and his years in Bozeman. Hendricks answered politely, just as he always had when neighbors greeted him. He didn't seem nervous, just distant. Then Chen placed a single photograph on the table, a picture of Sarah Mitchell taken shortly before her disappearance. Hendricks's eyes flickered toward it for a brief second, then back to Chen. She didn't rush. She let the silence hang heavy in the air. "We know you lived near her neighborhood in 1987, Chen said softly. "We know your routine. We know where you were." Hendricks didn't respond. Then Chen took out a document and slid it across the table. "And we have your DNA," she said, "from a coffee cup you left at the diner. It matches the DNA found in 1987. That's a full match, William." For the first time, Hendricks's calm mask cracked ever so slightly. His breathing grew heavier, and his hands shifted uncomfortably. He didn't speak, but the weight of the evidence was pressing down on him. He was no longer a nameless suspect. The truth was now inescapable. Chen didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She simply spoke the truth, clearly, firmly, and with compassion for the family that had suffered for so long. She talked about Sarah, about her parents who had spent years searching for answers, about a community that had lived with an open wound for decades. She told him that this was his chance to speak after a lifetime of silence. At first, Hendricks gave short, vague answers. He said he didn't remember, that it was too long ago, that maybe there was a mistake. But Chen remained steady. She calmly walked him through every piece of evidence, his proximity to Sarah, the witness statements, and most importantly, the DNA. As the interview went on, Hendricks's defenses slowly weakened. Decades of buried secrets began to surface. Finally, after hours of questioning, his shoulders slumped. He stared at the table for a long time, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was me," he said. With those three quiet words, 34 years of mystery began to unravel. Hendricks went on to confess in chilling detail. He explained how he had noticed Sarah walking alone that day, how he had followed her, and how the crime had unfolded. He described his actions not with passion, but with a cold detachment that unsettled everyone in the room. For the investigators, it was painful to hear, but these details were essential to understanding the full truth. He also admitted that he had never been questioned back then, never considered a suspect, and that over the years he had convinced himself the case was buried forever. "I thought it was gone," he murmured. "I thought nobody would ever find me." Chen listened carefully, recording every word. The confession was clear and complete. There were no more lies to hide behind. The man who had lived among the townspeople for decades, blending into their daily lives, had finally spoken the truth. Later that day, Chen personally called Patricia and Richard Mitchell, Sarah Sipp's parents. Her voice was steady but emotional, as she delivered the words they had been waiting to hear for most of their lives. "We have him, and he confessed." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by quiet sobs. For years they had lived with unanswered questions. Now they finally knew who had taken their daughter and why. It didn't erase the pain, but it brought clarity and justice after a lifetime of darkness. William Thomas Hendricks was officially charged with Sarah Mitchell's murder. His confession, combined with the DNA evidence, surveillance, and decades of records, built an unshakable case. The man who had walked unnoticed in their community for so long was now facing the consequences of his actions. For Detective Chen, the confession wasn't a moment of victory, it was a moment of truth. Justice had finally caught up with the past. The courtroom was completely full on the morning of September 18, 2021. Every seat was taken. People from all across Bozeman had gathered to witness something many thought would never happen. The final chapter of a case that had haunted their town for 34 years. William Thomas Hendricks, the man who had lived among them as a trusted crossing guard, janitor, and friendly neighbor, now stood before the judge as a convicted murderer. Detective Chen sat quietly near the front. She had spent countless hours piecing this case together, from the DNA breakthrough to the surveillance and finally the confession. But even she felt the heavy weight of the moment. Justice was finally within reach. But the emotional cost of getting there was impossible to ignore. Sarah Mitchell's parents, Patricia and Richard, sat in the front row. Patricia's hands were folded in her lap, holding the same worn photograph of Sarah she had carried to every vigil, every interview, and every police meeting over the decades. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried a lifetime of pain. Richard sat beside her, silently gripping the armrest of his chair, his jaw tight. They had dreamed of this day, but now that it had arrived, it brought a complex mix of relief, sadness, and exhaustion. When Hendricks entered the courtroom, he wore no handcuffs. He walked slowly, deliberately, dressed in a plain shirt and slacks. The same man who had once waved to children on their way to school now stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, facing the consequences of his hidden life. The atmosphere in the room shifted. People who had once trusted him stared in disbelief. Parents who had let their children walk under his watch now realized they had unknowingly let a predator stand at their crosswalks for years. Before the sentencing, the judge invited victim impact statements. Patricia stood first. Her voice was steady, though every word carried decades of heartbreak. She spoke about Sarah's childhood, her laughter, her kindness. She described the pain of watching birthdays pass without her daughter, the empty chair at family gatherings, and the way her basement had slowly filled with files, notes, and newspaper clippings, her own investigation that became her life's mission. She told the court about the sleepless nights, the fading hope, and the unimaginable burden of not knowing. Richard followed. He rarely spoke publicly during the investigation, but on this day he wanted his voice to be heard. He talked about how the crime had slowly eroded their family, how their marriage had been consumed by grief, how each day felt like living in a house where time had stopped in 1987. His words were few, but they were heavy, and the courtroom listened in silence. Then came Dorothy Hendricks, William's wife of 42 years. Her statement stunned many. She expressed her complete shock and disbelief, explaining that she had lived beside this man for most of her life and had never suspected a thing. She described the pain of learning that her husband was not the person she thought she knew. She said, "I shared my life, my home, and my trust with a stranger." Her world, like the Mitchells, had been shattered by the truth. The judge, Margaret Thompson, listened intently to each statement. When it was time to speak, her tone was firm and clear. She acknowledged the deep wound that this crime had inflicted not only on Sarah's family but on the entire community. Hendricks had lived among them, participated in searches for Sarah, and even offered condolences to the family over the years, all while knowing exactly what he had done. His betrayal of trust was profound. She sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. There was no dramatic reaction from Hendricks. He simply nodded slightly, as if he had expected it all along. But around the courtroom, quiet sobs and whispers broke the stillness. For the first time in decades, justice had spoken. After the sentencing, Patricia and Richard stepped outside the courthouse. Reporters surrounded them. Cameras flashed. But Patricia Sipp's words were simple. "We finally have answers. It doesn't bring Sarah back, but it brings the truth into the light, and that matters." In the following weeks, the community of Bozeman faced its own reckoning. Parents revisited memories of their children walking to school under Hendricks' care. Some discovered old photos where he stood smiling in the background of birthday parties and school events. It was chilling to realize how deeply he had blended into their lives. The school district quickly introduced stricter background checks, psychological evaluations for staff, and new safety procedures, changes that came decades too late for Sarah, but could protect future generations. For Detective Chen, the case had changed her forever. Solving Sarah Mitchell's disappearance was more than closing a file. It was about giving a grieving family the answers they had waited half a lifetime for. It was proof that truth can survive time, hidden in old coffee cups and family trees, waiting to be uncovered. Patricia Mitchell continued to visit Sarah's memorial every year, but now she did so knowing the full story. The man who had taken her daughter was no longer a shadow in the background. He was behind bars where he would spend the rest of his life. The town could finally begin to heal, slowly, piece by piece. Sarah Mitchell's story became a symbol of perseverance, a reminder that justice, even when delayed, can still find its way through determination, science, and the refusal to give up. The case of Sarah Mitchell is more than a story of crime and investigation. It's a reminder of how truth can remain buried for years, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, and the right determination to bring it to light. For over 3 decades, one family carried the weight of unanswered questions, and one community lived alongside a man they believed they could trust. In the end, it was persistence, science, and courage that broke through the silence. Every unsolved case holds the possibility of justice, no matter how much time has passed. Behind each piece of evidence is a family waiting, a community searching, and a story that deserves to be told. By learning from cases like this, we keep those stories alive and create pressure for the truth to surface. If you followed this case, consider sharing it to keep awareness alive. Subscribe to stay updated on other cold cases that still need answers. Your voice can help bring attention to the forgotten, and together we can make sure that no story is left in the dark.